pra Oslo, pra sair no Oslodum, bloco afro da terra do bacalhau.
Oi, tudo bem? Welcome to this 11th lesson in the special series I'm creating to help you to jumpstart your Brazilian Portuguese. I'm Professor Jason, and today's topic is asking and answering questions. What I'm going to do is teach you how to form and respond to some of the most common kinds of questions in Brazilian Portuguese. So as usual, we've got a lot to cover. Então, vamos começar. Let's get started. Okay, so as usual, and just to give you an idea of what to expect, here's an overview of today's lesson. We'll start off by talking about some formulaic questions and answers, things that just come up a lot and have set ways of asking and responding. Then I'm going to move into talking about 4 specific kinds of questions that I think it's helpful to distinguish among yes-no questions, either-or questions where you have a choice or alternative, interrogative word-first questions, all right, those questions that start with who, what, when, where, why, how, etc. And then finally a category I call what-do questions that have a form of the verb fazer, or to do. For example, what do you do on Saturdays? That require a certain degree of creativity. And then we'll finish up with a quick look at tag questions, which are very frequent in Brazilian Portuguese. Okay, so just what do I mean by formulaic questions and answers? Well, these are the high-frequency questions that are basically set phrases, right? How are you? What's your name? They're fixed expressions. The answers to these questions are often just as formulaic as the questions. So with these questions, you don't need to get super creative, right? They just are what they are. They're set phrases. So you just have to memorize them and how to respond to them and be prepared to use them a lot. Let's take a look. Here's some examples of some of those super frequent formulaic questions and answers in Brazilian Portuguese. On the first slide here, how are you, right? Tudo bem? Or tudo bem com você? And the response is simply tudo bem or tudo bom. Or you can add on the tag question, e com você? Tudo, e com você? A shorter version of that, tudo bom? Tudo, the response. How are you doing? Como você está? Bem, obrigado. That's simple. You don't need to complicate it. If it's someone for whom you have a little bit more respect, you want to show respect like an older gentleman or woman. Como está o senhor? Right? Estou bem, obrigado. Ou vou bem. And then finally, how's it going? How are you doing? Como vai você? Vou bem. Or just bem. If you want to ask someone their name, you just say, qual é o seu nome? Qual é o seu nome? And the response is just your name. So if somebody asks me, qual é o seu nome? I just say, Jason. Or I could say, meu nome é Jason. Similar, same meaning. Como você se chama? What's your name? Again, Jason or me chamo Jason. Very straightforward. Where are you from? De onde você é? De onde você é? Right? And here they're asking what country, depending on the context, what city, what region. Sou de, right? And here I use the preposition de, or a contraction. De, do, da, right? Sou do Brasil. De onde você é? Sou do Brasil. Or if I'm from Bahia State, I might say, sou da Bahia, right? Onde você mora? Where do you live? Onde você mora? Moro em. Here you have to use the preposition em, or contracted form na, nu, nas, nus, right? Moro em São Francisco. How old are you? Quantos anos você tem? Again, it's a set phrase, it's a formulaic question. It's how you ask people their age. Quantos anos você tem? And then you can just say your age, 25, or you can say tenho 25 anos. Formulaic response. Here we have some formulaic questions that deal with the time of day, the day of the week, and the date of the month. Okay, so if I want to ask what time is it, the question is que horas são? Que horas são? The response would be something like são duas, it's 2 o'clock, or é uma, it's 1 o'clock. I'm not going to go in detail into this particular response telling time in this lesson, right? But if it's 1 o'clock, you say é uma. If it's any other time, you say são duas, são três, são 4:30. What day is today? What day is it? Que dia é hoje? Que dia é hoje? You can just say sábado, segunda, terça, or you can say hoje é sábado, right? What's the date? What's today's date? Qual é a data de hoje? Qual é a data de hoje? 29 de dezembro. So you can see the formulaic response is just the number, preposition de, and then the month. 29 de dezembro. What day of the month is it? Qual é o dia do mês? É dia 29. Again, you could just say 29 or é dia 29. These are very formulaic questions and responses. And here we have our last set of formulaic questions and answers. If you want to ask, what's the weather like today, there, in a certain location, you say, como está o tempo? Como está o tempo? You could respond, weather's great, o tempo está bom, it's sunny, faz sol, or it's raining, está chovendo. And of course, there are many other possible responses, but we're trying to keep things simple. So, como está o tempo? Tempo está bom, faz sol, está chovendo. Now, pretend you're at a market and you want to know how much something costs, right? Quanto custa? Quanto custa? And you can add the object or complement after that if you want to name the thing, right? So if it's that shirt, quanto custa essa camisa, right? And then the person responds, custa, and then however many reais, right? Brazilian reais. So quanto custa? Custa 30 reais. All right, so that pretty much covers it for your basic formulaic questions and responses. Remember, you just memorize those. You're going to hear them a lot, and those are the responses you give. You don't have to be too creative. Now, what we're going to do next is go over 4 specific kinds of questions, right? The first type we're going to look at are yes or no questions. Then I'm going to transition into either or, where you have a choice, an alternative. We're going to look at interrogative word first questions, those questions that start with words like who, what, when, where, why, how. And then finally, I'm going to finish up with a category that I call what do you do questions, right? That involve o que você faz, right? For example. Now, with each of those 4 question types, I'm going to try to point out a few things. For example, what is it that's being asked for? What information is being requested, right? I'll also show you how the question's formed. What's its basic syntax, structure, word order, etc. Okay? And then similar to that, we'll talk about what's the basic response structure. How do you typically respond to those kinds of questions? And then I also want to categorize or characterize the responses in terms of how open are they, right? Do you just say yes or no? Do you just pick the alternative? Or do you have to supply some information? How creative can you be? And in turn, how complicated, how difficult is that for language learners in terms of asking and answering? Then, of course, for each question type, I'll show you about 8 to 10 examples so you can get a better idea. After we go through those 4 question types, I'll finish up with a look at tag questions in Brazilian Portuguese. All right, here we go. So we're going to start off looking at yes-no questions, right? Like, for example, você fala português? You're asking a yes-no question. So what are we asking? We're asking whether someone does something, yes or no. Or we can also put these in any tense. Did they do something, right? Você falou português? Did they used to do something? Você falava português? Will they do something? Você vai falar português? These are all yes or no questions, regardless of the verb tense. Like I said, for each of these main question types, for example, here are the yes-no questions, I'm going to sort of spell out for you what the typical syntax for the question and the response are. So in the case of a yes-no question, like você fala português, you have the subject, você, the verb, falar in this case, and then the object or complement of that verb, português. That's how you form a yes-no question in Brazilian Portuguese. Now, how do we respond to a yes or no question? Well, if we want to respond in the affirmative, if I want to say, yes, I do speak Portuguese, notice the response structure, the word order, the syntax. I put the verb in the first person singular eu form first. So I actually say falo. Você fala português? Falo, right? Falo sim. That's how you respond. So if somebody says, do you live here? Você mora aqui? Moro sim. Now logic dictates that since we're talking about yes or no questions, the response might be no. So in that case, this is your structure, this is your syntax. You say no. Then you repeat no, usually, and then the verb, and then if you want, the object or the complement of that verb. So in this case, if I don't speak Portuguese, somebody asks, você fala português? I would say, não, não falo português. Right? Somebody says, você mora aqui? Do you live here? No, eu não moro aqui. So you can see that with these yes or no questions, obviously, the response openness, the degree of that is very little because you're just indicating yes or no. So these are extremely easy questions to form and to respond to. All right, so what I want to do for each of these question types is provide, 6 to 8 examples. So for our yes-no questions, right? Você estuda muito? Do you study a lot? Estudo sim. Remember, that's the syntax. Estudo sim. Estudo bastante. Bastante means quite a bit, right? I study a lot. Você mora nos Estados Unidos? Não. Não moro nos Estados Unidos. If it was affirmative, I would say moro sim. Moro sim. Você não gosta de conversar? And I wanted to put some negatively worded questions in there, right? Você não gosta de conversar? You don't like talking. Gosto sim. Gosto muito. I like it a lot. Vocês vão jantar mais tarde? So we have a sort of a question in the future, referring to the future. Are you going to have dinner later? Vocês vão jantar mais tarde? Vamos sim. So the verb that I'm conjugating is ir. Vamos sim. Você não quer escutar música? Quero sim. The verb I'm keying in on is querer. Quero sim. Or não. Não quero. Não quero escutar música. Você precisa chegar cedo? Preciso sim. Or não. Eu posso chegar tarde. I can get home late. Okay, moving on to our either or choice alternative questions. Right? This is when somebody asks you, does somebody do option A or option B? Might be, do they speak it? Do they prefer it? Do they want to do A or B? So we're just asking the person to indicate option A or B. Você fala português ou francês will be our example question. So the person we're just asking, do they do option A or B? Fala português ou francês? An either or question. As you can see from this slide, the question syntax or structure or common word order would be subject plus verb, in this case, falar again, and then the option, right? Option A, then the word ou, which means or, and then option B. Você fala português ou francês? That's your typical syntax for an either or question. The typical response syntax or structure or pattern would be to state the subject, unless it's the first person singular, which many times it will be, you're talking about yourself. You don't have to say eu falo, right? You can just say falo. We have the verb and the subject combined, and then indicate the option, option A or option B. Você fala português ou francês? Falo francês. Now, you might not think about this, or I guess maybe it's obvious, but with either or alternative choice questions, you always have the option of saying, I do both, right? So I don't have to say pick option A or pick option B. So I could say, falo os dois. Você fala português ou francês? Eu falo os dois. I speak both languages, os dois. So os dois is a good generic way for saying both. If both elements, option A and option B, are feminine, grammatically feminine, you could say as duas línguas. Or another way to say both in Portuguese is ambos or ambas. But keep in mind you have to have agreement, right, in number and gender. So, fala português ou francês? If I want to say I speak both, falo os dois. So just to sum up a little bit with these either or choice alternative questions, right? Again, as with the yes/no questions, your response is not very open. You simply indicate which option. Is it option A, option B, both, neither, right? So you can't be too creative, right? Although you could say, falo francês, and then go off and explain how you learn French or whatever, right? So in terms of degree of difficulty for learners, these can be basic questions. These are easy to form and easy to respond to. So for learners at the novice or the basic level, beginner level, these should be easy to form and easy to respond to. So let's just go through a few examples of these either or questions and possible responses. Do you study history or art? Você estuda história ou arte? Estudo arte, right? Picking option B. Or I study both. Estudo ambos. Estudo ambos. Você dançava bem ou mal? So here we have an adverb in our choices, in our selections. Você dançava. Did you dance well or not so well? Dançava mal, right? Você prefere, right? Many times these either or questions might involve the verb, right? Você prefere, to prefer. Você prefere livros ou filmes? Prefiro filmes, mas também gosto de livros. But I also like books. So adding a little flexibility, creativity into the answer. Você vai estudar ou assistir o jogo? Right? Are you going to? Você vai estudar ou assistir o jogo. Vou assistir o jogo. I'm going to watch the game. And then finally, você queria trabalhar ou descansar? Você queria trabalhar ou descansar? Eu queria descansar. Alright, so as I mentioned in the overview, we're also going to talk about interrogative word first questions. These are the questions that begin with interrogative words, right? The equivalents for words like who, what, when, where, why, and how in English. And on the slide, what you're seeing are the most common interrogative words that can begin questions in Brazilian Portuguese. So we have quem, which is who, or o que, which is what. And in Brazilian Portuguese, it's always o que for what. Qual, or the formal or the plural form quais for which. Quando, always with a Q, for when. Onde, where. And then for how many, how much or how many, quanto. And it has to sort of inflect for number and gender. Quanto, quanta, quantos, quantas. Why? Por quê. Por quê. And then how. Como. So, quem, o que, qual, quais, quando, onde, quanto, por quê, e como. So what are we asking for when we use an interrogative word first question? Well, we're asking the listener, the person we're conversing with, to supply the information that's elicited by the interrogative word. So we're asking them to say who, what, when, where, why, how many, etc. Now when it comes to the word order, the structure, syntax, pattern of these interrogative word first questions, one thing's for sure, the interrogative word comes first, right? And then generally, if you're thinking with your English-speaking brain, the pattern is very similar to English. So look at my example. Quem mora nessa casa aí, right? Who lives in that house over there? Who lives in that house over there? So generally, the structure of these interrogative word first questions are going to be very similar. You won't have the sort of the auxiliaries. You won't have the do or the did. You can leave those out, right? So in general, the formula is interrogative word plus the subject, then the verb. So subject, verb, then object, just like, right, in English. Now, you're going to see in the examples that in some constructions, you might have an inversion and the verb may precede the subject. So you'll notice that. But again, in general, the syntax or the word pattern follows that of English. So, how do you respond to an interrogative word first question? Let's look at our example. Quem mora nessa casa aí? Quem mora nessa casa aí? You just give the answer, right? Short answer is you just give the answer. Meu vizinho, my neighbor, right? Now I could give the answer in subject, verb, object form, right? Meu vizinho mora nessa casa aí, right? Another option you have, if you don't know the answer, of course, is to say, não sei. Não sei quem mora nessa casa aí. Another form is, I have no idea, which is, não faço ideia. Não faço ideia. So in the case of interrogative word first questions, right, now we're getting to the point where our responses are becoming a little bit more open-ended. And that's because, right, in contrast with the yes or no or the either or questions, the response isn't implied or even embedded in the question. The listener has to come up with a response based on their experience. So that makes these questions a little bit harder to respond to for basic or novice learners, right? It's almost kind of on the cusp of an intermediate learner. Because if somebody asks me a question like, when do you study math? I have to respond from my own experience, right? It's not a fixed response. It's not a yes, no, or an either or. A little bit trickier. So let's go ahead and look at a few more examples of interrogative word first questions, right? Just simple examples and responses. What are you reading? Remember I said it's o que, right? O que você está lendo? Subject, verb, object. Você está lendo. Estou lendo uma revista. Estou lendo uma revista. Quando? When? When do you study? Quando você estuda? Estudo depois do trabalho. Right? So again, you're answering based on the interrogative. What's that question asking? It's asking when. So my response focuses on when. Estudo depois do trabalho. Por que você não me ligou ontem? Why didn't you call me yesterday? Por que você não me ligou ontem? Não liguei porque estava muito ocupado. So you can see how these types of responses require a little bit more creativity. Right? If somebody asks you why you didn't call them yesterday, right? Not always the easiest answer to come up with. Não liguei, past tense, porque estava muito ocupado. I was very busy. Right? What's your name? Como você se chama? Remember we saw that in the formulaic question section. Como você se chama? Eu me chamo Julia. E você? Tag question. How much does that book cost? Again, we saw this construction in the formulaic question. Quanto custa? Quanto custa esse livro? Quanto custa esse livro? Esse livro custa R$30. Let's go ahead and look at a few more examples of interrogative word first questions, right? So, which is or what is your favorite restaurant? Qual é o seu restaurante favorito? Eu prefiro a pizzaria rústica. E você? Quando é? When is? Quando é o exame de química? Quando é? É na quinta-feira, lembra? Right? Sort of a tag question there, right? It's Thursday, remember? É na quinta-feira, lembra? Now you might notice on this slide, right, where the verb is ser, right? The form is or the verb is ficar. That we have that inversion I talked about where you have the verb before the subject in the question, right? Assuming that the subject is the restaurant, the exam, your school, your city, right? Onde fica a sua escola? Onde fica? Where is your school? Fica no centro da cidade. Again, the subject is the school. A minha escola fica no centro da cidade. How about yours? Tag question. E a sua? What is your city like, right? Como é? Como é a sua cidade? Whenever you want to ask what something is like and have the person describe it, whether it's a person or a place or thing, como é? Como é a sua cidade? A minha cidade é pequena, mas é muito bonita. Now, when it comes to formulating questions with interrogative words at the beginning, keep in mind that you can add a tremendous amount of flexibility by adding prepositions, those little words like a, de, com, em, por, or para, to some of these interrogatives, right? So take a look at the slide, right? We have quem, which means who, but I can make it with whom, for whom, of whom, by adding com, para, de quem. We have okay, right? Slide says que, but it should be okay, right? But when I add the preposition, I drop the o. So para que, for what purpose, right? De que or do que, em que, com o que, with what. So by adding these prepositions, we add flexibility and we can change the meaning somewhat of these interrogatives. With qual, right? Para qual, for which. Por qual, right? Through which. Em qual, de qual, com qual. So don't forget you can add prepositions. With onde, right, there's the distinction between aonde, to where, or para onde. So just to illustrate a little bit this principle about adding flexibility and even changing a little bit the purpose of our question, what we're asking for, I have some contrasting questions here. One with just the simple interrogative, like, quem mora nessa casa? Example that we've been talking about, and then changing it slightly to com quem você mora, right? With whom do you live, right? Com quem. Or o que é, right? I'm asking for a definition, an explanation. O que é o glúten, right? That's one question, but what if I asked para que serve? Para que serve o glúten? So by adding para que, I'm now asking about the purpose, right? The purpose of gluten, right? Qual vestido de noiva devo comprar? So here the bride is asking which dress. But if I add em qual and form a question like em qual país fica Dubai? I'm asking in which or in what country, where, basically. Onde você trabalha? The simple straightforward use of onde, where do you work? Onde você trabalha, right? In what place? But if I start a question with aonde, here's that distinction. Aonde você vai? I'm asking the person about their destination. To what place? Where are you going? All right, the last of the four kind of specific kinds of questions that I wanted to differentiate are questions that involve a form of the verb fazer. I'm calling them what do questions or o que fazer questions, okay? Look at the example. O que você faz aos sábados? O que você faz aos sábados? So what are we asking? With these kinds of questions, right, we're asking what somebody does in a certain context or under certain circumstances. And of course, we can conjugate fazer in any tense to find out what they did, what they used to do, what they will do, etc., right? We can also add verbs like gosta de fazer to ask what they like to do, or precisa fazer to find out what they need to do, right? Or quer fazer to find out what someone wants to do. So we'll see examples of these. So on this screen you can see the basic syntax structure or word pattern for these what does somebody do questions, right? You start with the form o que, which means what, as we've been noting, and then the subject, o que você, and then a form of the verb fazer, which means to do, and then optionally any additional context, right? What the linguist would call an adjunct, right? So a prepositional phrase or something like this, like we have in this case, aos sábados. So, o que você faz aos sábados? That's the basic pattern. Now with these types of questions, right, when somebody asks you, what do you do, what do you like to do, what do you need to do, what do you want to do, what are you going to do under certain circumstances, there's some flexibility in the response, of course, but the basic pattern is you say subject-verb or subject-verb combined, as we have on this slide, saio. And then, now it's important to point out that the verb, even though the verb in the question is fazer, or a form of fazer, the verb in your response is normally, right, 90% of the time, not fazer, because the person's asking you what you like to do and you answer with that activity, right? So in this case, o que você faz? Eu saio, I go out with my family. Eu saio com minha família. So it's subject verb, that verb's not fazer, it's the verb that indicates the activity that I do, and then I can add the context. So I could say, saio com minha família aos sábados. Of the four basic question types that we're looking at in this video, I think that with these, we have the most open-ended responses, right? Because the answers really call for a certain amount of creativity, personalization to your experience. If I ask you, what do you like to do on weekends? O que você gosta de fazer nos finais de semana? I have to be creative and I have to personalize the answer, right? And so these definitely are not questions that beginners can handle easily, right? It takes some practice. So these are questions for sort of those intermediate to advanced learners. They're a little bit tricky. Let's look at a few more examples on this slide. I think I've got another 5 examples of these what do you do or o que fazer kinds of questions, right? So notice that in the question in white, there's a form of the verb fazer. In the first two we have faz and fez. And then in the last 3 questions, I've added the forms gosta de fazer, like to do, vai fazer, right? What are you going to do? And quer fazer, want to do. Okay, but notice that in these responses, the verb is not fazer, as I mentioned, right? So, o que você faz quando chove? The context is when it rains. Eu fico em casa e assisto televisão. I stay home and watch TV. O que você fez ontem? What did you do yesterday? Eu lavei o meu carro. Remember, I don't have to say eu. Lavei o meu carro. I washed my car yesterday. O que você gosta de fazer em casa? What do you like to do at home? Gosto de navegar na internet. I like to browse the internet. O que você vai fazer amanhã? Vai fazer, what are you going to do amanhã, tomorrow? Vou estudar. E você? O que você quer fazer hoje à noite? Quero, so the verb I'm conjugating is querer. Quero jantar e ir ao cinema. All right, now we're almost done. Just to finish up, I thought it would be interesting and also important to talk a little bit about tag questions or question tags. Tag questions are those brief questions that follow or sort of tagged on to declarative sentences. So examples of tag questions in English, where they're also very common, would be things like, that car is expensive. That's my declarative sentence. That car is expensive. But then we often add a tag. That car is expensive, right? Or, that car is expensive, isn't it? That car sure is expensive, don't you think? You're thinking about buying it, aren't you? So as you can see, the communicative function of these kinds of tag questions or question tags is usually to elicit a confirmation or some other kind of response. So some of the most common tag questions in Brazilian Portuguese are taking the negative não and adding é. Não é, não é. And it's usually just shortened to né, não é, né, né. Okay? So we'll see some examples. It's also very common to take that negative não, 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 and add a verb form. Não vai, não tem, não foi, não está. It's also common to use as a tag question the form está, or more commonly the shortened form tá, right, which means okay, right, okay. So if I say, wait for me here, tá, right, me espera aqui, tá, okay. E você, like in English, means and you. E você, e você. There could be a possessive, like e o seu, and yours. E a sua, if it's a feminine thing that we're talking about. And then finally, view, right? View. Okay, so we're going to see some examples of how these tag questions work in Brazilian Portuguese. All right, so I might just make a statement like, você gosta de café? And then add the tag question. Não gosta. Você gosta de café? Não gosta, don't you, right? Or, it's hot out today, isn't it? Né? Faz calor hoje, né? And then I might tell someone to do something and say, viu, like, got it? É para você ficar aqui. You need to wait here. Viu? Got it? É para você ficar aqui, viu? Or, você vai para a aula. Remember, these are declaratives, just sentences. Você vai para a aula. Não vai? Aren't you going? You're going to class, right? Right? Você vai para a aula, não vai? Or, call me when you get home, okay? Me liga quando chegar, tá? Or, my car is black, and yours? Meu carro é preto, e o seu? So adding tag questions like these is extremely common in Brazilian Portuguese, which means it's something you definitely need to be on the lookout for and try to incorporate into your own speech. All right, well that just about does it for lesson 11 in the series. I hope you found this presentation on how to ask and answer questions to be informative and useful. If so, please share it with others and let me know if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, okay? I really would love to hear from you. Be sure to catch the next lesson in the series, and don't forget to look for me on all of your favorite social media platforms. I'll roll my contact information in the credits here in just a minute. Thanks again very much for watching, and be sure to visit the Professor Jason channel again really soon. Até breve. Tchau.
Eu vou pra Oslo, pra sair no Oslo do